Have you ever run into someone from your past, only this time they're caring for the very person who once cast them aside? Evren, a successful millionaire, returned home after years away. He stepped into his mother's hospital room, and there was Naraya, his old girlfriend, gently wiping the sweat from the woman's brow. No bitterness in her voice, no need for anyone to know. She was simply still there. And from that moment on, everything Evren thought he knew began to shift. A reunion without words, yet enough to stir all the years he'd thought were long buried. The hospital room door opened with the faintest sound, like wind brushing past an old wooden frame at dusk. Evren stepped inside, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the cold, white tile. But it was the silence itself that made everything ring like a muted bell. The room looked just as he remembered, clean, orderly, tinged with that sterile coldness that hovered in places where people waited between life and death. But one thing was different. Naraya was there. She sat at the edge of the bed, her back gently curved toward the frail woman lying motionless beneath the sheets. Her small hand adjusted the IV line with quiet care. Her dark hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Every movement was deliberate, steady. She hadn't noticed Evren yet, or if she had, she gave no sign. He stood frozen at the threshold, years apart. The words they'd never said, the wounds, he thought, long buried, they all surged up in an instant, and the scene before him, so impossible, cut through him like a blade. The girl he once loved, the one his mother had rejected, now tending to her with a silence more powerful than any declaration. He hadn't spoken yet when Naraya turned around. That first look between them wasn't quite a look. It was a collision, wordless, quiet, and full of all the things that had once tethered two lives into one. There was surprise in her eyes, but not a flicker of unease. No tears, no reproach, just a stillness honed by many seasons of rain. Naraya, he whispered as if her name had never left his chest, never gathered dust. She didn't answer. She simply tucked a small cloth under the woman's pillow. An unconscious gesture. The cloth. He recognized it immediately. A worn, hand-stitched handkerchief. The fabric had faded, the indigo thread frayed in places. But he knew it. Naraya had given it to him on his 22nd birthday. A crooked E embroidered in one corner. He had laughed at the time, and she'd gone quiet, hurt when he didn't use it. He remembered that afternoon in perfect detail. The two of them on a park bench. She held out the gift. He arched an eyebrow and smiled. A handkerchief. You don't really think men use these, do you? She'd said nothing, folded it up, and tucked it away. That night, he'd known he was wrong, but never found the words to say so. Now, here it was again. Under his mother's pillow, his throat tightened. "How long have you been here?" he asked, voice carefully even, though the question itself sounded like it belonged to some half-remembered dream. She didn't look at him. A year. A year. She had been here. Every day. While he was in New York, meetings, investments, multi-million-dollar deals. He hadn't returned once since his mother's stroke. Why? He asked before he could stop himself. This time she met his eyes. Because no one else came. He stepped back slightly. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the bare, clean weight of truth, and it hurt more than anger ever could. His mother lay still, eyes shut, her face drawn and hollow, as if time had wrung from her every trace of the iron-willed woman she once was. The same woman who once said, in front of both of them, "You will never love someone like her." "She's the last person I should be here for," Naraya said, her voice quiet, steady. "And the last person who ever wanted me here." Everin said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He moved closer to the bed, stared at his mother's face, and in that moment, it felt like looking at a stranger. In the silence that followed, every unsaid word seemed to breathe. Through the old handkerchief, through Naraya's quiet persistence, and in his own aching realization, he had no good reason to have forgotten her. A pale shaft of sunlight fell across Naraya's hair. She didn't turn back. She just sat there, like a shadow from a past he had lost, and a present he wasn't sure he had the right to reclaim. Everin turned to leave, footsteps heavy. But beneath his mother's pillow the handkerchief remained, unspoken, unmoved. A silent witness to everything love had once touched and left behind. The old house still carried the scent of damp wood, that musty, earthy smell he had known all his life but never truly liked. The door creaked open, not from age but because something inside Everin cracked open with it. Something he'd long since locked away. He hung his coat on the hook and walked slowly down the hallway, past the shadows of childhood and the sharpest cuts of memory. This house had once been filled with laughter, and with silences the adults never dared to name. Upstairs, the old sitting room. A few photographs still hung on the wall, but one corner was bare. He moved to the wooden cabinet beneath the window, the place where his mother had hidden everything she didn't want seen. The bottom drawer let out a groan as he pulled it open, stirring up a cloud of dust that caught in his throat. Inside, he found an old picture frame, cracked, the glass shards lying scattered like splinters of broken time. The photo had been torn, violently. On the right side, Everin's image remained. White shirt, bright smile. The left side, just a fragment of dark hair. The face had been cut out, mercilessly. He didn't need anyone to tell him. It was Naraya, and the memory surged up so fast he had to grip the arm of the chair to steady himself. 17. Sunlight spilling into the living room. Naraya stood behind him, her hands gently circling his shoulders, pinning a small embroidered handkerchief to his shirt, the first one she had ever made for him. They were laughing. The whole room pulsed with light and sound, until the sharp click of his mother's heels echoed from the hallway. Everin turned just in time to see his mother's eyes fall on Naraya's hands. No greeting, not even a nod of acknowledgement, just that cold stare, as though something had just bruised the deepest pride inside her. "Everin, come here." He followed her into the kitchen. No words, no questions. Dishes crashed as she swept the dinner tray from the table. Rice scattered across the floor. And then, the sentence that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "You will never love someone like her." He had stood still, just stood there. And Naraya, still in the living room, had surely heard every word. His hand trembled as he picked up the broken frame, a shard of glass slicing lightly into his fingertip. Blood welled up, mingling with the dust of years. He didn't pull away, didn't wipe it clean, as if this wound, at last, deserved to be seen. The frame was cracked, but the wooden border remained. He turned it over and found it. Faint, nearly faded, the message once carved in pencil by a teenage hand. May 17th, our first birthday together. He exhaled, but the sound caught somewhere in his chest, between sorrow and a kind of forgiveness that hadn't yet found its voice. Everin placed the frame on the table, the torn photo face up to the ceiling, as if letting the old truth breathe again. I stood there, he whispered, eyes on the ripped paper, while they erased her, and I didn't stop them. The room held its silence. No music, no voices, only the soft wind brushing through the open window, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and something that might have been regret, too late to name. Everin stood for a long time, and when he finally left, he didn't take the frame with him, but the memory inside it he no longer dared to forget. That morning, the hospital was unusually still. Every footstep echoed off the white tile floors and high ceilings like the sound of something about to happen, something no one dared to name. Everin leaned against the hallway wall on the third floor, hands buried in the pockets of his coat, eyes fixed on the door to room 312. Morning light streamed silently through the long window pane, casting a thin thread of brightness across the opposite wall. Right where he stood, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the distant beep of a heart monitor, the soft roll of bed wheels down the corridor. Together, they formed a quiet symphony of waiting. He didn't know how long he'd been there. 5 minutes, 10, or since before the sun had risen. All he knew was he couldn't bring himself to leave. Then, Naraya stepped out. She wore a pale nurse's uniform, her white coat fitted neatly to her frame. Her hair was tied high, revealing the curve of her slender neck and dark eyes that no longer held softness. She didn't look up at first, and Everin didn't move. Not out of fear, but because, after all these years, he realized he no longer knew where to begin. Their eyes met, no words, no hello, no how have you been, no it's been so long. Just a gaze, colliding in a white hallway stretched long like a memory no one had the courage to clean out. Naraya hesitated, just for a second, long enough that someone watching might think she was about to speak. But then she walked on, slowly, as if Everin weren't even there. He took a step forward. Wait. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop her. Naraya didn't turn around, but her feet stopped moving. I didn't come to apologize. His voice was hoarse, like each word had to be dredged up from someplace old, someplace buried. I came because I couldn't not come. The words fell into the hallway, landing on the polished floor like a stone dropped into still water. A ripple, but not enough to break the surface. She still didn't turn. But he saw her hand tighten slightly around the notebook she held. A small motion, but he noticed. Then, she said at last, her voice dry, clipped, but not unkind. Stay there if you want. And then she walked on, light, deliberate. Her figure disappeared around the corner, leaving Everin alone, surrounded by the silence that clung like snow. He didn't follow. Not this time, because in that brief instant, he understood. Some distances can't be bridged by an apology. They can only be acknowledged. By staying, without demands, without hope. He turned and walked slowly toward the bench near the window. Sat down, ran his hand over the strip of sunlight stretched across the floor. Somewhere inside that long silence, something began to shift. Not forgiveness, just the start of learning how to endure each other again, from far enough away not to wound each other anymore. Twilight often carries with it a feeling that resists naming. Not quite sorrow, not quite solitude, but something that softens the heart without warning. The hospital room on the third floor lay quietly under the last golden light of day, which cast a thin, honeyed glow along the bed rail, stretching across the faded white curtain worn thin by sun and rain. Evren sat still by the window, eyes drifting toward the hospital courtyard where tree shadows swayed gently in the breeze. The past few days unraveled in his mind like an old film in slow motion. Each encounter with Naraya stirred memories that surfaced like bubbles in still water, silent, sudden, and gone in an instant. The door opened so softly it made no sound. He might not have noticed if not for the scent of cinnamon that slipped in first, warm, mellow, a little sweet, like the touch of a small hand threading through his hair in the days when they were young. A tender echo of sweetness in a life that had grown sharp with distance. Naraya entered, carrying a small tray of pastries. She still wore her white nurse's coat, neatly buttoned without a detail out of place. Her black hair was tied high, her posture crisp and composed. She placed the tray on the small table beside the bed, carefully lifted the lid of the paper box. The cinnamon rose into the air like a breeze from a long-forgotten place. Evren turned, his gaze catching on her figure, and for a moment the world went quiet. He sat up and asked softly, "Cinnamon, you still remember how to make these?" Naraya didn't look at him. Her hands were busy smoothing the blanket over his mother, who slept on. "It's not about remembering," she said. "Some people need to feel warmth, even when they don't know how to ask for it." Evren let out a faint laugh, tinged with something bitter. "That scent. I thought I'd never smell it again." Silence. She stood straight, hands folded before her, looking down at the old woman. She doesn't eat much, but she always wakes up when the smell's in the air. Like her body remembers something, even if her mind doesn't. Evren nodded. The body remembers before the heart does. The words slid between them like a blade, opening a seam in the past they had each tried to stitch shut with time. He had been 23, newly placed in an internship at a prestigious law firm. Naraya was still a nursing student living in a tiny apartment just a few blocks from his house. She had quietly saved for weeks to buy a second-hand mini-oven, just because he once mentioned liking cinnamon pastries. On his first birthday after they began dating, it had rained all afternoon. Naraya spent hours baking her very first batch. The scent filled her apartment, clung to her clothes, soaked into her hair. She waited for him. Waited like a child waits for family on a holiday. He came late, far too late, because he had dinner with his mother. By the time he arrived, the pastries were cold. Naraya smiled anyway, holding out the box with wide, hopeful eyes. "It's your birthday," she'd said. "You have to try one I made myself." He'd taken a bite, then joked without thinking. Hard as a rock. She hadn't replied, just quietly wrapped the pastries again, her eyes dimming like a candle snuffed out. They hadn't fought that night. But from that moment on, Naraya never baked again. Now the scent of cinnamon returned, not in a warm kitchen lit by soft yellow light, but in a sterile hospital room where life hung as delicately as the beep of a heart monitor. "I thought you'd forgotten," Evren said quietly, afraid the scent might vanish if he spoke too loud. Naraya looked at him, for the first time that day. Her gaze was no longer guarded, not cold. It held something deeper, steadier. "Some things you don't cook again because you want to," she said. "You cook them because you still remember how your hands trembled the first time." Evren swallowed. He moved to sit beside his mother. She slept on. Her face was etched with the creases of time, like paper worn too thin to hold the stories it once carried. All that remained were the faint outlines of a woman who had once been unyielding. "Did she ever say anything about you?" he asked. Naraya shook her head. "No. But she never refused the pastries I brought." Such a simple answer, but it tapped gently against a door in his past. The door behind which a mother had once screamed, "You will never love someone like her," and behind which a boy had chosen silence and lost something precious. "You made these for me," Evren said, eyes searching the space between them. "That first birthday. And now, you're making them for the person who couldn't accept you." Naraya didn't answer, but in her eyes a small light flickered. A final ember not yet gone out. She turned and walked away. Left the D. Pastries behind, didn't look back. But her footsteps, quiet, deliberate, echoed through the room like a bell tolling from the past. Some wounds don't need to be mentioned to bleed. Sometimes a scent is enough to open them again. Evren stayed. He picked up a pastry. It was still a little too hard, still filled the room with that same intoxicating warmth. He closed his eyes and, in the chill of the hospital room, whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for remembering, for..." The last rays of afternoon light had long since faded, but the scent of cinnamon lingered in Evren's mind like a memory that refused to dissolve. He sat alone in the empty corridor, staring in the direction Naraya had gone. She hadn't looked back, hadn't been cold either, just silent, a silence that held its own gravity, shrinking the world around it. The pastry box still sat untouched on the table in the hospital room. Evren had reached for it, had closed his eyes to remember, but found he didn't have the courage to go further. He didn't leave the hospital. Instead, he drifted down to the ground floor as though something invisible was tethering him there. Perhaps, somewhere in this quiet, he might finally name what had gone unspoken for far too long. The hospital cafe was nearly empty, just a few scattered people nursing paper cups, their eyes lost in the spaces between IV drips, and whispered prayers. Evren ordered an Americano. The sharp bitterness stung his lips, but he needed that. Needed something real enough to keep him from unraveling in the spiral of his past. And then, a familiar voice behind him. "Evren," he turned. It was Dr. Alma. She looked just as he remembered. Slim, short-cropped hair touched with gray, a thin scarf around her neck scented faintly of lavender and warm tea. Dr. Alma. He stood, gestured for her to sit. She smiled softly, but her gaze was more observant than welcoming. "You don't look like someone just passing through." Evren offered a faint smile. "I stayed a while after seeing my mother." Alma nodded. "And saw Naraya too." He said nothing. "I saw her," Alma added. "Earlier this afternoon." The smell of cinnamon from her tray filled the whole hallway. Evren swallowed hard. "I didn't expect she'd still be baking." Alma studied him for a moment as if weighing something long kept to herself. "Evren, do you remember your 23rd birthday?" His chest tightened. She didn't wait for an answer. "That night I was leaving late. The rain was heavy. As I passed your house, I saw Naraya standing at the door. No umbrella. Not calling out. Just standing there. holding a box wrapped in brown paper and red string. Everin sat frozen, not in surprise but in something deeper, some ancient recognition. He had always known something had happened that night, had always been afraid to ask. She stood there over an hour, Alma continued, her voice slow and deliberate. Soaked, shivering. But she didn't move. When I asked why she didn't go inside, she said, "I'm waiting for someone to open the door." Everin's shoulders collapsed as if something inside had finally lost its scaffolding. "And you," Alma said, not accusingly, just stating the truth, "were inside." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the now cold cup in front of him. "I heard the knock," he said, "but my mother said it was just the mailman. She told me not to open the door in the rain. I believed her. Or, I chose to." "No, Everin," Alma replied gently. "You didn't choose anything. You stayed silent." The words carved through the last of his defenses. He bent forward, hands clenched tightly. "I came back the next morning," Alma said. "The box was still there, wet, never opened. I took it home. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like something that had been turned away, but should have been cherished." She reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of worn brown paper, the red string frayed. She placed it in front of him. Everin touched it, so softly it seemed he feared it would vanish. The paper remained, but everything it once held had been buried with the rain of a long-ago night. "I think," Alma said quietly, "today's pastry box is the same as that one, only this time the lid was opened, but still no one ate." Everin let out a crooked, aching laugh, because he still doesn't know what to do with what he once rejected. She placed her hand over his, warm and firm, like a hand that had healed many things. "Everin, not everyone gets a second chance to face their oldest wounds." He nodded. Slowly. The scent of cinnamon still lingered in the air, but now it was more than just the smell of pastries. It was the scent of something old being gently unwrapped. If you were Naraya, would you have stayed? Would you have been able to offer warmth to someone who once closed the door on you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you pause, even just for a breath, don't forget to like so I know you're still here. The hospital room was unchanged from the night before. The same white bed, the steady whisper of the ventilator, the curtain drawn just enough to keep the morning light from pouring too harshly over the patient. But when Everin stepped inside, something felt tighter, less spacious, not because of the room itself, but because of the weight of feeling now pressing in on him. After his conversation with Dr. Alma the night before, he hadn't slept. His dreams had blurred into shadow, and when morning came he knew, without reason, without question, that he had to return here, to the place where perhaps all the wounds began. And maybe, just maybe, where they might also end. His mother was sleeping. Her face was thinner than it had been yesterday, silver hair unruly on the pillow. One hand rested lightly over the blanket, fingers curling slightly as if trying to hold on to something not quite there. Everin sat down beside her, and as his hand brushed the edge of the pillow, he froze. Something was beneath the fabric. He reached under gently and pulled out a small object, a handkerchief. Everin stilled. It was the one Naraya had embroidered for him. Deep indigo thread, a simple design, the letter E tilting awkwardly in the corner, the edges frayed. He remembered every uneven stitch, every time she bit her lip in concentration beneath the yellow lamp in her tiny apartment. She had laughed then, saying, "It's worth nothing, but I hope it's worth keeping." He had tucked it into his shirt pocket once, and then, one day, it was gone. He assumed it had slipped out, or maybe his mother had thrown it away. He never asked, yet here it was, under his mother's pillow. He couldn't believe it. His hands trembled as he placed the handkerchief in his lap, staring at it as though it had appeared from another world. "How did she have this?" he whispered. "Did you come back?" He stood, pacing the room as thoughts crashed through his mind like waves breaking. The birthday night, the rain-soaked paper wrapping, the unopened box of cinnamon pastries, and now, this handkerchief, tucked beneath the pillow of the very woman who had once uttered the cruelest words. There was no one to answer, no one in the room. But that small square of cloth, so still, so unassuming, seemed to speak all the words that had never been said. He lifted it once more, walked to the window. Morning light filtered through, revealing the faded threads, the softened creases. A thought struck him. Had his mother kept it? After all her cold words, all her refusals, was it possible that, at some forgotten moment, she had opened a drawer, found this piece of the past, and slipped it beneath her pillow? Quietly, secretly, as if trying to hold on to what she once cast away. Or had Naraya returned on a day Everin wasn't here and left it, deliberately, gently, as a silent offering? There were too many questions and no answers. Everin placed the handkerchief back where he had found it, as if taking it away might shatter something fragile and irretrievable. The door opened softly. He turned. It was Naraya. She stepped in, the light behind her touching her hair like sunlight through old glass. She paused when she saw him, not surprised, not angry, just a flicker of something quiet and unreadable in her eyes. Everin looked at her, then at the pillow. His voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "The handkerchief under the pillow. Was it you?" Naraya didn't move closer. Her gaze held his for a long moment before she slowly shook her head. No. Silence. The answer, simple and spare, did not bring clarity. It deepened the mystery. If not Naraya, then it had to be his mother. He sat again, and for the first time, something inside him trembled. A piece of memory shifted. He had never imagined his mother, so sharp, so unyielding, could have kept anything that belonged to Naraya. "I didn't leave it," she said softly, "but I saw it there, a few weeks ago. You didn't ask her." She gave a faint smile. "Some things, when kept in silence, are maybe the kindest things we can offer." Everin had no reply. He simply sat, his hands clutching the fabric of his pants. "If she did keep it," he murmured, "then maybe there was something inside her she never said aloud." Naraya didn't answer, but her eyes softened, just slightly, as if the handkerchief wasn't merely a keepsake but proof that something had, at some point, quietly yielded, even if only for a moment. Everin looked up at her. "I'm sorry for never asking if you needed me to open the door." She didn't smile, she just nodded. But that single nod felt like the quietest, truest opening of all. And the little handkerchief, still tucked beneath the pillow, was never mentioned again. But from that moment forward, it ceased to be just a scrap of cloth. It became an unspoken confession. A thread stitching together three lives that had once fallen away from one another, and now, however tentatively, had begun to come back. Morning in the hospital room settled as gently as a late autumn breath. Everything looked the same. The curtain swaying faintly, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, the soft scent of antiseptic, just strong enough to remind anyone who entered that this was a place people passed through the most fragile chapters of their lives. Everin sat alone, his gaze lingering on the handkerchief beneath the pillow, a small, threadbare scrap of fabric that carried the breath of a time no one dared speak of. They hadn't mentioned it yesterday. But Naraya's quiet answer, "It wasn't me," had opened something inside him, a door behind which he'd stored memories too carefully folded, too long buried. And now the past slipped in like mist, light but seeping deep. 6 years ago, it had rained that night. Not hard, no thunder, just the soft, persistent kind of rain that slips under your skin, the kind that makes anyone waiting feel cold in their bones. Evren had returned from a birthday party his family had thrown, crowded, noisy, forgettable. He unlocked the gate and stepped into a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. His mother greeted him, a new silk scarf in hand, her eyes sweeping his face with that practice scan, checking for anything out of place. "Why are you home so early?" I'd had enough. There was no tension between them, but there was no warmth either, just a long-settled distance, formed in the years since she decided her son would not love a girl who wasn't suitable. Rain tapped on the awning, like the soundtrack to a film whose ending everyone already knew. Evren climbed the stairs, loosened his tie, sat on his bed. Inside, a hollow he couldn't name. Downstairs, the front door was locked. No one told him that just beyond it, just steps away. Naraya was standing in the rain. She wore a thin raincoat, both hands wrapped around a brown paper package, tied with red string. Her long hair clung to her neck and shoulders, her eyes fixed on the gate, not pleading, not calling out, just quietly waiting, as if she believed that if she stayed long enough, someone inside would feel her presence. But no one did, and the person who met her was not Evren. It was his mother. "What are you doing here?" Naraya lowered her head, her voice smaller than the rain. "I just came to bring Evren a birthday gift. You should stop this habit. He's no longer the kind of boy whose life you belong in. No insults, no raised voice, but no softness either." Each word was precise, cold, and cut where it hurt the most. Naraya clutched the box tighter and then let go. It fell to the wet ground. The red string unraveled. The paper soaked through and began to bleed. She didn't pick it up. She just stared at the door in front of her, now shut, now locked. A period written too softly to erase. Then she turned and walked away into the rain. No anger, no blame, only something in her eyes had gone dark, completely, now. Evren rose, his hands shaking slightly as he tucked the handkerchief back under his mother's pillow. The emptiness inside him was no longer a void, but a tight, crowded place stuffed with all the words that had never been said. The door opened. Naraya stepped in. Her shadow stretched across the floor. She carried nothing. No pastries, no water, no cloth. Just herself, like a memory made whole. Evren looked at her. His voice was soft, as if afraid to disturb the delicate stillness between them. "I remember that birthday night. I remember the rain. But I didn't know you were at the gate." Naraya paused. Her gaze wasn't sad, just certain. "I know." He lowered his head. I didn't open the door. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know you needed me to." She took a step closer. "Some people stand in the rain, not to be let in. They just want to be allowed to wait there for a little while." Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't a wall between them. It was recognition of two people who had once stood on either side of a door and missed each other, not for lack of love, but for lack of courage to knock. The clock on the wall read 1:47. Mem. The hospital was wrapped in a kind of stillness rarely found elsewhere. Not sleep, not peace, but something more fragile. A hush that made people speak in whispers and walk softly, as if even a misstep in sound might shatter everything holding the night together. In room 312, a dim lamp cast a pale golden light over two hands holding a cloth. Naraya didn't need to check the time. She'd learned to measure the hours by the warmth of the towel and the frequency of sweat returning to the patient's brow. The fever had spiked an hour ago. Nothing alarming, nothing unexpected, just enough to keep her awake. She folded the fourth towel, set it back into the bowl of cold water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the older woman's forehead. Her hands moved softly, as if too much motion might hurt the past. The woman lay still. The lamplight shimmered across damp skin, casting a sheen like rain on glass, a memory of another night in the rain. Only this time, no one waited outside the gate. No gift dropped into puddles, just Naraya. And a fever, 20 years earlier. A cramped, stifling room. Saigon's summer heat pressing in. The electricity had gone out. Evren burned. With fever, his breathing fast and shallow, no words, just broken murmurs as if, even in dreams, he was running. Naraya had been in her second year of nursing school, green, untested, untrained. But she knew illness. She knew what it meant to be alone in pain, because she'd lived it. And so she knew, when someone's burning with fever, what they need most isn't medicine. It's someone. She sat by his bed through the night, swapping towels, wiping his chest, brushing damp hair from his face. Every time he moaned, she clenched her fists to stay calm. Every time the thermometer ticked higher, she whispered, "Just make it through the night." She never told anyone about that night, never expected it to earn her anything. And when their love later unraveled like old thread, she never used it to justify what had been now. Naraya placed the fifth towel against the woman's forehead. She still hadn't woken. Naraya studied the closed eyelids, the deep lines carved. By time at the corners, the woman who had once slammed a door in her face now lay in front of her. Fragile, silent, like a book left unfinished. She didn't feel anger anymore. If she had, she wouldn't have stayed. Wouldn't have sat here for 4 hours beside. Someone who never once said she needed anyone. She dipped another towel into the water, folded it with care. When she leaned in, a bead of sweat from her own brow fell and landed on the back of the woman's hand. Indistinguishable from hers now, she said nothing aloud. But her heart whispered, "This isn't for obligation, not for family, not even for Evren. It's just, when someone is sick and needs their forehead wiped, whose hands could possibly stay still?" In the hallway, Evren stood against the wall, not daring to go in. He didn't know what had brought him here at this hour. Maybe a dream. Maybe the handkerchief beneath his mother's pillow. Or maybe something deeper, a ghost that still hadn't let him go. He saw the light still on, saw Naraya's shadow move gently behind the curtain. steady, quiet, tender. He couldn't hear her voice, but he could feel every word it wasn't saying. Each time she changed the towel, he felt himself unworthy of her patience. Not because of what he had done, but because of all the things he hadn't. Near dawn, the fever began to break. The woman's breathing slowed. Her hand shifted, barely brushing the edge of the blanket, then went still. Naraya stood, adjusted the pillow, dimmed the light. Before leaving the room, she paused, looked back once at the figure on the bed, and then spoke quietly, whether to the woman or to herself, or to a memory once turned away. I stayed, not for love, but because no one should be sick and alone. The words didn't echo, but they traveled far, to the woman in the bed, to the man outside the door, and to a closed door from long ago that had waited too long to be opened. Morning arrived earlier than usual, not because the sun rose sooner, but because the fever had passed, and Naraya no longer had a reason to stay awake. She had just finished pressing the final cold towel to the woman's brow. The old woman slept, breathing evenly, her face peaceful. No more sweat, no furrowed brow, only fingers curled faintly as if waiting for someone to hold them. Naraya remained seated, not out of duty. She simply wasn't ready to leave. She looked down at her own hands, still trembling after the long night. But this time, the shaking wasn't from fear or exhaustion. It was memory that had touched her. Every time she'd been pushed away, every quiet dismissal. You don't belong here. Each time she'd stepped back from a threshold. Tonight they had all returned, carried in the eyes of a woman now sleeping, the very woman who once cast her out. And it was that, more than anything, that kept her here. Not to seek forgiveness, not to be acknowledged, but to sit and listen one last time to the silence of a heart that had once refused to soften. Then the woman opened her eyes, slowly, gently. Light brushed her pupils like a whisper. Her gaze wandered, blurred and searching, then found Naraya's face. No words at first, just a look, layered, quiet, like seeing through 2 decades at once. Naraya stood, lifted the damp cloth from her forehead, and bowed her head. She expected nothing, hoped for nothing. She simply did what she had always done, quietly, patiently. "Is it really you?" the woman rasped, her voice rough, hesitant. Naraya looked up, unsure if she was recognized or if she was simply part of a dream not yet separated from waking. "I'm here," she said, her voice soft but certain. Silence. 1 minute. 2. And then a tear slipped from the corner of the woman's eye. No sob, just water falling, like something long buried at the bottom of her soul had finally reached its edge and couldn't be held any longer. She whispered, her lips trembling as if each word struck something brittle inside. "I turned you away. That night." Naraya didn't move closer. She didn't know what to do, but her hand, almost by instinct, gently touched the old woman's. A simple touch, but it made the woman's shoulders shake all over again. "The box," she said. "I saw it, but I didn't open it." Her voice cracked. "And the handkerchief." Her eyes turned toward the pillow. "I kept it, because I couldn't throw it away, but I never had the courage to let anyone see." Now the tears flowed freely, not hidden, not restrained. They came like a stream, rinsing a soul worn thin by years of denying what it couldn't face. "I ruined you both," she wept, "because I wouldn't look at her heart." The words didn't ring loudly, but they struck the deepest chord inside Naraya. She hadn't cried in years, not because she hadn't been hurt, but because no one had ever acknowledged that her pain had been real. Now, the very person who once threw her into that darkness was the one to speak it aloud, and only now did her tears come, not from bitterness, not from blame, but because, finally, someone had seen her. Everin stepped into the room then, just in time to witness what he'd never once imagined: his mother, iron-willed and unshakable, crying in the hands of the woman she once cast aside. And Naraya, silent, hand resting gently on hers, crying for the first time. Everin stood still. He didn't speak, he didn't step in, because today wasn't a day for him to say anything. It was a day for two women, once on either side of a wound, to finally reach each other through something no apology could ever express, but through something else, something that at last was enough. Enough to begin again. Morning sunlight swept across the stone steps of the small garden tucked behind the hospital, a quiet corner few ever visited. A lone wooden bench rested against the wall, half in shade, half in sun, as tree branches above shifted gently, letting the light sway like a slow breath. Naraya sat there, her back slightly hunched, hands clenched tightly around a small ivory-white pillbox. It was no larger than her palm. The casing was worn, but the label still fresh. The fever medication she'd handed the night nurse just hours ago. It was over now. Evren's mother had apologized. She had wept. She had spoken what once felt unspeakable. And Naraya had cried. For the first time in years. But this morning, there were no more tears. Only a long, hollow stillness that stretched from the pit of her chest to her fingertips, where the pillbox was now crushed slightly in her grasp. She had thought it would feel lighter, but it didn't. Only empty. As if everything she'd carried inside, the unsaid, the uncried, the unacknowledged, had finally been pulled out, leaving behind a blank, echoing space. From the hallway, Evren stood at a distance watching her silhouette in the garden. He couldn't hear her, but he saw her shoulders tremble. Faintly, not from the breeze, but the kind of trembling that comes from holding too much for too long. A tremor born of survival, not weakness. He stepped forward, then stopped. Because sometimes people need space to break. Naraya stared down at the pillbox, opened it, closed it, opened it again, closed. There were no clear voices in her mind, only a tangle of old echoes. You don't belong here. That girl stood in the rain for an hour. I destroyed both of you. Each phrase reverberated like sound from the bottom of a well, not loud, but deep enough to catch in her throat. Her fingers loosened. The pillbox slipped from her hand and hit the stone. A soft click. So quiet, no one else would have noticed. But to her, it was the sound of something final, something that had been held too tightly for too long, now giving way. She didn't reach down to pick it up. She just sat, eyes dry, face blank, but her whole body trembled as if one wrong word, one stray touch, could unravel her entirely. A single drop landed on her hand, not clear whether it was a tear or dew from her hair. Like the pillbox, it made no sound, but it confirmed what could no longer be hidden. What had broken was no longer holding itself together. Evren approached quietly, unhurried. He said nothing. He sat on the bench beside her at a careful distance, close enough not to leave her alone, far enough not to trespass. They didn't look at each other. They just sat, together, in the tender gold of early sunlight, as the breeze moved across the eaves above them. After a long while, Naraya spoke. Her voice was quiet, unforced. Not a confession, just something drawn up from the depths of her own silence. I didn't cry because I forgave her. I cried because someone finally admitted the pain was real. Evren didn't answer, because nothing needed answering. Apologies would be too much. Comfort would fall flat. What needed to be said had already been said. What remained was this: staying. To witness the moment someone breaks, not in tears, but in the kind of silence that tells you the breaking has already happened. The small cafe behind the hospital grounds was as quiet as the morning after a storm. Outside, it wasn't raining, but the leaves were still wet. The air was clear, the chill slipping gently through the window's edge. Evren was already there. The coffee in front of him sat untouched. He hadn't come to drink. He had come to sit in a place where he could face things without armor. And when Naraya entered, there was no bell, no greeting. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat in silence, no averted eyes, no unnecessary questions, just two people, one unspoken past and a present with nowhere left to hide. Evren spoke first, his voice low, rough. She told me everything. Naraya didn't nod, didn't confirm. She simply looked at him, her gaze stripped of bitterness, only honesty left behind. I know I stayed silent too long, he said. Not too long, she replied. Exactly long enough for everything to fall past saving. He looked down at his hands. I didn't think you'd still be here. Naraya smiled, not with irony, not with pain, just the kind of smile that comes after too many. Tears, when crying is no longer a language you use. I didn't stay for either of you, she said. Some people just shouldn't have to be sick alone. Evren looked up, eyes rimmed with something close to breaking. That night in the rain, I didn't know you were there, but I didn't ask. I didn't look. Naraya exhaled, softly. I stood there, holding that box, soaked through until I couldn't feel anything. But the part that made me shiver wasn't the cold. She met his eyes, for the first time, without turning away. It was not knowing which side I belonged to. Evren swallowed hard. Inside him, memories rewound like an old cassette, each second a clean, aching slice. You were the one outside the gate. But the worst part, she said quietly, was seeing you inside and not moving. He had nothing to say, because it was all true, and because there were no excuses left that could soften it. A long silence stretched between them, taut like a wire between two wounds that once belonged to the same body. Finally, Naraya closed her eyes. I used to believe that if I loved enough, I'd be chosen. But that night, I learned, sometimes the person you love won't choose you when it's hardest. Evren whispered, I didn't have the courage to open the door. No, she said gently. You didn't have the courage to step outside. That difference, that was what had broken everything. Outside, The sunlight had climbed. There was no conclusion, no promise, only the truth, spoken for the first time, sharp as a needle finding its mark, but this time not to deepen the pain, only to let the last of the blood drain, so the wound might finally begin to close. The coffee on the table had long gone cold. The conversation was over, but neither of them stood. Naraya remained still, her fingers resting on the cup but not lifting it. Evren stared out the window, watching strangers pass like shadows, with no bearing on their lives. There was nothing more to say. The conversation, without touch, without tears, without even a goodbye, had already broken what needed to break. After a long silence, Evren reached into his coat pocket and placed a cream-colored envelope on the table just beside her coffee. "This isn't an apology," he said softly, eyes still on the street. "It's just, if you ever feel like standing somewhere, there's a place that's waiting." Naraya looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She recognized the handwriting immediately. And she understood, whatever that place was, it wasn't about him. It was hers, if she chose it. She said nothing. But when she stood, the envelope came with her. 3 days later, she returned. No message. No call ahead. The Shama Rehabilitation Center appeared through a veil of old trees, with its clean white walls and wooden nameplate glinting in the sun. Evren wasn't at the gate, and he didn't need to be. She walked in with the opened envelope in her bag and the signed contract in her hands. Naraya placed her name at the bottom of the last page like someone underlining a final sentence. Not for Evren. Not to be seen or validated, but because after that conversation, after saying, "I didn't know which side I belonged to," she finally understood. This time, she would stand on her own. By noon, she stepped into her new office, the first space assigned to her not by favor, not by name, but by merit. On the desk, the contract lay folded. By the window, a cascade of violet blooms cast quiet shadows across the floor. The sunlight touched her shoulder like a small, quiet welcome. This wasn't the place where love began, nor a place built to hold old wounds. It was where she chose to begin, herself for the first time, not for anyone else. Naraya looked down at the contract and smiled, not out of relief, but because, for once, she didn't need permission just to exist. Sometimes, returning to a place isn't about the past, it's about no longer being afraid of it. Naraya's first day as head nurse didn't begin with applause or formal welcomes. It began with silence, a soft gray morning in April, when sunlight still hid behind the oak trees outside the Shama Rehabilitation Center, and the air carried the scent of fresh timber from the newly completed therapy wing. She entered the group room where elderly patients were arranged in a quiet crescent. Each held their own kind of silence. Some gazed absently through the windows. Some sat with eyes closed. Some looked like they'd forgotten why one would open their eyes at all. In one corner stood an old piano, its wood darkened with age, draped in a heavy cloth, as if no one had touched it in years. Naraya didn't have time to ask about it before. She heard a soft sound. A slim intern with wire-framed glasses stepped forward. Without a word, he removed the cloth, sat on the bench, took a breath, and began to play. The music came gently, simply, a quiet classical piece, no drama, no flourish, but it stirred something low and deep in the chest, as though it tapped, Gently, on doors long closed, Naraya remained at the back of the room. She didn't recognize the piece, but she remembered the feeling. It took her back to a memory long buried, in a modest care home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, where she'd done her final year internship. There had been an elderly woman, partially paralyzed, long unresponsive, her eyes always vacant, until a volunteer played this very melody by the window. And then the woman opened her eyes, and tears fell, wordless, motionless, but alive again. In the way her gaze finally landed, Naraya had never forgotten that moment. And now, this music, in this bright therapy room, surrounded by quiet, time-worn faces, played again. She glanced toward an old man by the window. He'd arrived 3 days ago. His chart read, nonverbal, not eating, no response. But now, the corner of his mouth lifted, a smile, barely there, but real. Naraya felt her throat tighten, not from pain, but from something delicate awakening inside her. No one in the room noticed her. No one knew what was shifting in her chest. But she knew. A piece of herself had just returned. When the music ended, no one clapped. No one needed to. The silence that followed was enough, like the final note still trailing softly in the air. After the session, she returned to her new office. The desk was clean, the chair unused. She didn't turn on the computer. Instead, she pulled a blank sheet from the folder. She wrote slowly, "I don't know if that music saved anyone, but it called me home." She pinned the small note to the corkboard beside her desk, between shift schedules, treatment charts, and meeting agendas. A reminder to herself that sometimes rebirth doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a song, a flicker of a smile, a quiet heartbeat in a chest that had long gone still. The sun had softened by the time Naraya stepped out from her final therapy session of the day. A light breeze swept along the wooden porch behind the center, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the damp hush left behind by last night's rain. An older woman, dark-skinned, her eyes clouded but still strikingly alive, called out to her before she could return to her office. In the woman's hands was a small ceramic pot, white and unadorned, with a single green sprout pushing up from the soil. "For you," she said, her voice steady, not frail. "I can't grow things much longer, but it still can." Naraya hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting gifts. But the woman's hand remained outstretched, not waiting for a yes, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to pass on hope in the form of something still living. She brought the plant back to her office. The room was still the same, tidy, quiet, lit just enough by the afternoon sun to read without turning on the lamp. But today, something shifted, because at the windowsill she placed the small pot down, right where, years ago, she had once laid her resignation letter. Naraya sat, brushing her fingertips across the still rough soil. The seedling, no taller than her littlest finger, stood straight and certain. Its first leaf had unfurled, tender, not yet hardened, but unmistakably reaching for the light. She remembered those late afternoons at a different clinic, in another life, when she had sat in the same position, drafting resignation letters she never sent, each one written at the edge of burnout. Each time she thought she'd reached her limit, but never once did she dare to submit them. And then it happened anyway. She hadn't been given a choice. The door she was never really allowed to open was finally closed from the other side. Now it was different. No one pushed her out. No one pulled her in, and she had stayed. A staff member knocked, handed her a new tracking log, and left. Naraya didn't move. She kept her gaze on the windowsill, where the late sun poured a pale gold over the new green. Something settled quietly inside her. Not sadness, not pain, just a softness, like earth after rain. It had been a long time since she let herself feel that. No fight, no flight, just presence. The afternoon slipped by gently. Before she left the room, Naraya placed a small label at the base of the pot. Hyssop, the plant's name, and a symbol of cleansing and healing across many cultures. She exhaled, releasing something old and unnamed, and thought to herself, for the first time, I want to see something grow, because I chose to stay. Evening at the Shama Center always fell gently, like a thin blanket drawn over the fatigue of a long day. Therapy rooms dimmed their lights one by one. The halls grew quiet, the last soft whir of a hand dryer at the corridor's end echoing, like the steady breath of a place slowly slipping into sleep. Naraya stepped into her office, going through the familiar motions, tidying files, checking the shift schedule. She expected nothing unusual. She only wanted to close the day in the quiet peace she had come to cherish. But something was different. At the edge of her desk, beside the windowsill where her small plant had begun to unfold its third leaf, sat a small cloth pouch tied with a pale lavender ribbon. She paused. It had been a long time since she'd received anything unexpected. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, the scent rose. Lavender, soft and clean, and so familiar. It knocked gently against a memory she hadn't meant to open. Back then, after long hospital shifts, she'd brew lavender tea, sachets bought from a tiny corner shop where the owner always added with a wink, "Won't fix a broken heart, but helps you sleep through it." She drank that tea through the first months of loving Evren, and the day they ended, she tossed the last sachet away. A quiet ritual of letting go. And now, this. She didn't open the pouch. She lifted it, turned the tiny tag hanging from its string. No name, no note, just presence. But she knew. Evren had been here. No visit, no knock. Just this. Left like a whisper, saying all the things that had never been said. She placed the tea beside the plant. One thing growing, one thing steeped in memory. Together, they formed a small corner of peace she'd never dared to claim before. No one else would notice the pouch was there. No one needed to. She wouldn't drink it. She wouldn't throw it away. Because some gifts aren't meant to be used. They're meant to remind you. Someone, somewhere, once remembered you quietly. Before switching off the lights, she glanced around the room, the last of the sunlight skimming the edge of the desk, illuminating the handwritten note she'd pinned days earlier. I don't know if that music saved anyone, but it called me home. And tonight her eyes lingered on the tea beside it. Then, softly to herself, she whispered, "Not everything is meant to be steeped. Some things only need to be kept." Afternoon settled over the Shama Center like a sheer veil draped over the day's final sounds. Soft, golden light spilled across the hallway, glinting off the spotless windows, so clean they mirrored each footstep that passed. Today was the memorial for Evelyn, Evren's mother. There was no grand ceremony, just a quiet candlelight gathering in the common room. No white flowers, no somber music, only those who had seen her in her final months and those she had once turned away. Evren stood alone before the tribute table. At its center, a black and white photograph, his mother in youth, unsmiling but with sharp, luminous eyes. Beside it, a small wooden frame was left empty, and in the middle of it all, lit by the gentle flicker of candles, lay a handkerchief, faded, frayed, but the stitched initials, Nay V, were still clear. Naraya's, the woman who once loved him, the woman his mother had once closed the door against. Evren picked it up. His fingers traced the creases like someone learning a language they had long refused to read. The cloth didn't speak, but the past whispered anyway. In the back of the room, Naraya entered quietly. No one had called her. No one stopped her. She chose a place near the wall where the candlelight just grazed the hem of her coat but didn't touch her eyes. A breeze moved gently through the old windows, carrying with it the scent of wax and aged wood. From where she stood, she watched as Evren folded the handkerchief, carefully, slowly, edge to edge, thread to thread. He said nothing, but that silence spoke more honestly than any apology ever could. When he placed the cloth back on the table, something in the room seemed to still. He bowed his head and whispered, "You were the last thing my mother denied, and the last thing she chose to keep." As people quietly left the room, their footsteps fading down the hall like a soft exhale, Evren remained. Naraya didn't approach, but she sat on the bench near the door, as if together they were keeping watch over not just a passing, but a closing chapter in both their lives. Evren turned to her. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, he simply looked at her with eyes that had shed the armor, the boyhood, the need to prove something to a mother who was no longer there. He walked over, sat beside her, said nothing. And in that stillness, there was no need for words, because everything that mattered had already been placed between them. In the cloth, in the candles, in the quiet presence of the one they once hadn't been brave enough to hold. As evening deepened, Evren returned to the table and lit a second candle. He stood there for a long while, and then his tears came, for the first time in years, not out of regret, but out of the quiet courage it takes to let go, to admit that letting go isn't betrayal, but the beginning of truth. The truth that a mother can be wrong, and so can a son. That night, Naraya returned to her office. She opened the drawer that held what no one else knew, a scribbled note of emotion, an old envelope, and a second handkerchief. Never given. She took it out. This one was stitched more deliberately, more carefully. At the corner, in fine gray thread, a phrase, "Even what's not said." She folded it gently, not to give it away, but to lay to rest her part of the story. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the Shama Center's hallways as if no one had ever wept there. Evren and Naraya passed each other in the back garden. They didn't stop. They didn't speak. Only a brief nod as they moved past, but in that nod, a quiet, tender beginning. Some things can't be spoken aloud. They must be placed down by hand, like the way he laid the handkerchief on his mother's altar, and the way she laid the past exactly where it belonged, folded, not torn, not clung to, just closed. The weekend morning at Shama Rehabilitation Center began with soft music drifting from the therapy wing. The scent of weak coffee from the communal area mingled with lemongrass oil from the reception desk, creating a kind of gentleness in the air, something that made the place feel less like a center for healing and more like a place for learning how to be human again. Naraya stood in the group therapy room, adjusting the crescent of chairs. She glanced at the morning assignment, bored, then toward the window where sunlight pooled gently on the floor. Outside, family members were arriving. A frail woman escorted by her son, an elderly man in a wheelchair pushed forward by his wife, and one chair, by the window, always left slightly apart meant for family, remained empty. She didn't expect anyone to take it. Not today, not now, but she had placed it there that morning anyway. Just once, to see if an empty space could become something other than a pause. Evren arrived late. No warning, no knock, no waiting for someone to open the door. He paused in the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, his gaze drifting across the room. Naraya, by the whiteboard, caught his eyes briefly, then looked away. No long glance, no nod. Just a presence. Undeclared, but unmistakable. He stepped inside, slowly. Without urgency, but without hesitation. The patients were all ready, seated in a loose arc, some chatting, some still. Evren scanned the room, and his eyes settled on the chair by the window. A chair that belonged to no one, but said more than any nameplate could. No one offered it. No one introduced him. Naraya didn't look at him. But as he approached and quietly took the seat, without title, without claim, she let out a breath so soft it barely rose in her chest. One of the patients, the older man who'd smiled during the music the other day, turned to Evren and nodded as if greeting an old friend. Evren smiled back. For the first time since his mother's death, something inside him began to loosen. Not because he was forgiven, but because he had stopped fighting what he felt. The session passed without fanfare, just simple stretches, a few memory games, a soft song humming through the old speaker in the corner. But in that room, someone had sat down who no longer stood on the outside. And someone had seen it, and smiled quietly. At the end, as chairs were being pushed back into place, Naraya bent to reorganize her clipboard. Evren stepped toward her, not too close, just enough that his words could be heard. "I used to think you needed permission to sit here," he said softly. She didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the chair that had now been moved. But maybe. Not everyone needs to be invited. Their eyes met, brief, open. For the first time, nothing stood between them. Naraya gave a quiet nod, then said gently, "I once left because there was no seat for me. Today, you stayed without needing one. No hug. No hand held, just two people, sharing a space where silence was no longer distance, but understanding, and the empty chair. Today, someone had chosen to sit down." The first Monday morning brought nothing extraordinary. Shama Center opened at 7, as always. The halls carried their familiar whisper of peppermint oil, and the staff room coffee machine gave its usual sharp hiss when someone overfilled. The reservoir again. There were no banners, no bouquets, no applause, only a door quietly opening, and a woman named Naraya stepping inside as if she'd always belonged, as if this day were simply a continuation of every day before. But she knew better. Today was unlike any day that had come before, because this was the first time she was chosen to lead, not to fill a gap, not to smooth someone else's discomfort, but because of the path she had walked with her own 2 feet. Her new office bore a small steel nameplate beside the door. Naraya Valen. Head nurse engraved in modest lettering. No embellishments, no color. But when her fingers traced the cool edge of that plate, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her schedule for the day lay neatly on the desk. 4 physical assessments, 2 individual therapy sessions, 1 meeting with the junior nursing staff. But the first thing Naraya did was open the window. Cold air rushed in, scented with wet earth and the distant call of a bird. She drew a deep breath and closed her eyes, not to remember, but to feel the present, something she had forgotten how to do for too long. At the morning meeting, there were no speeches. Naraya offered a quiet smile, said her name, and invited each person to share a brief thought from their last shift. No effort to command. No need to impress. She didn't enter to make noise, she came to listen. Midday, she passed through the therapy wing. A few patients recognized her from her earliest days as a trainee. One nodded. One said, "Congratulations." One said nothing at all, just looked at her and held the gaze a little longer than usual. That, too, was recognition, from those who had once been forgotten, and now saw someone who hadn't forgotten them. Later that afternoon, she returned to her office. The door was slightly ajar. Wind stirred one corner of the curtain and a shaft of sunlight reached the small potted plant beside her desk, the one gifted by the elderly patient. It had sprouted 2 new leaves. Beside it still sat the old lavender tea pouch, untouched, unopened, a memory left exactly as it was. Naraya sat down and opened her management journal. On the first page, she wrote, Day 1, not of a job, but of a person who once believed she had no worth. Then she closed the book, not to hide it, but to keep going. She left late that evening. The office door clicked softly shut behind her. But before walking away, she turned and opened it again, just to make sure the door was still open. And this time, it was open for her. Monday, the start of a new week. The sky was a pale gray, but the rain held off. Not cold, not warm, just that in-between kind of weather, like a quiet shifting between 2 lives. Naraya opened the office door at exactly 6:58, not because an alarm had gone off, but because her body was already wired to the precision of someone who'd spent years backstage, caring for others, everyone but herself. Her desk was neat, as always, a stack of files, a cup of warm tea, not lavender this time, but mint, and a brand new journal, placed there that morning by the admin manager. The cover was thick and smooth, and in the lower right corner, embossed in silver foil, Shama Rehabilitation Center. Head nurse's clinical log. Naraya didn't open it right away. She sat down, ran her fingers lightly across the surface. Cold, smooth, familiar. 15 years ago, she'd been handed a notebook just like this one. Her first day as a full-time nurse at a rehab center in Central Oregon. She'd been young then, too new and terrified. She wrote everything in blue ink, aligned each line perfectly, as if, by following the rules, she could convince the world she belonged in it. The first page had read, Patient 0412, fractured T6 vertebrae, pain level 810. Medication started at 10:15 a.m., and in the margin, barely visible in tiny pencil. Remember, this one used to love jazz. She used to think she'd forgotten, but this morning, holding the new notebook, she realized what we write for others might fade. What we write for ourselves comes back. She opened to the first page. No date. No patient ID. No standard morning shift heading. She wrote, "First day, not of a job, but of someone who once believed she no longer mattered." Just one line. Measured. Her handwriting wasn't as precise as it used to be, but it carried weight. A while later, she closed the notebook, planning to record the day's shift notes later. But her fingers lingered at the edge of the page. Morning light spilled across the desk, catching the outline of a small plant reaching out a new leaf. The only thing in the room not planned, not assigned, yet quietly growing. Beside it lay a lavender tea sachet. Evren's, left the day before. Still untouched, and today its presence didn't stir sadness anymore. Just something like gratitude. Around noon, during shift change, a young nurse stepped in to drop off the day's care assignments. "You've started the log already?" she asked, glancing at the notebook. Naraya nodded slightly. Her eyes still on the plant. "Yes. But I wrote about myself first." "Yourself?" the girl asked, frowning. "Yes," Naraya said, turning to look at her. Her gaze was neither stern nor light, because no one should care for others, without first looking at the part of themselves that's still hurting. The young nurse didn't say anything, but she nodded slowly, like someone who didn't fully understand, but knew enough to know it mattered. That afternoon, Naraya walked the halls of the treatment wing. She wasn't checking charts, just moving slowly, stopping whenever she heard laughter or a long, rasping cough, or the soft murmur of someone calling their son's name in a fogged dream. At one point, she paused outside room 207, where the old man had once smiled hearing a piece of classical music. The door was ajar, sunlight slanting across the pillow, and on the wall, a photograph his family had sent. A young man playing the violin, eyes glowing like dusk. Naraya stood still for a moment, then moved on. Back in her office, she sat down, opened the notebook, and wrote beneath the first line, "I used to forget. I, too, need care. Today, I'm writing it down, not to save as a keepsake, but as a reminder that each blank page doesn't just wait for data. It can wait for the truth. And the truth is, she is coming back to life. Quietly, without announcement. In the smallest of ways, like a blank notebook." Before leaving her office, she closed the journal, placing it neatly at the edge of the desk, beside the little plant, on one side, something growing, on the other, something just beginning to remember, and in between, her. Tuesday morning at Shama was just like any other, 6 a.m. First light streaming through the east wing, the faint scent of weak coffee rising from the lower floor, and the familiar creak of wheelchairs inching across polished wood. At 6:40, Naraya left her office with the clinical logbook in one hand and a small pouch of clean handkerchiefs in the other. She headed straight for room 212, temporary quarters for Clara, a new patient admitted 3 days prior. No family had accompanied her, no next of kin forms, no visitors, just an elderly woman with hollow eyes, a hoarse voice, and one sentence she repeated often, "I don't need anyone." This morning, Clara had refused breakfast, refused therapy, refused even to have her hair brushed. The night nurse reported that she had shouted and swatted at anyone who tried to help. Naraya didn't ask why. She simply knocked, softly, and stepped in when no answer came, as if Clara had been waiting, but didn't know how to ask. The room was modest, its single window letting sunlight in through a thin veil of dust. Clara sat turned toward the wall, her back slightly hunched, hair tangled and falling over her shoulders. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. Just silent. The kind of silence that comes when anger has long since worn itself out. Naraya placed the handkerchief pouch on the chair and pulled one closer to Clara. She said nothing. She sat. Her hands stayed still. After a long while, Clara spoke, quiet and worn. "I lived my whole life needing no one, and I'll die that way too." Naraya didn't respond. She just looked down at Clara's hands, trembling, creased, dry as linen washed too many times. Then she said gently, "I used to wish someone would hold my hand like this." Clara didn't turn, but her shoulders gave the faintest shudder, and in that moment, no grand truths, no lessons, just the raw fact between two people, one who had been left behind and one who had learned never to leave. Naraya reached out and laid her hand over Clara's, not tight, just enough for Claire to know someone was here. And then she began to cry, not loudly, not brokenly, just slow, quiet tears slipping down cheeks long since dried out by solitude. Naraya didn't move. She didn't wipe the tears away. She only held Clara's hand like she was holding the girl she used to be. After a while, Clara whispered, "I used to think, if no one needed me, it would be better if I disappeared." Naraya nodded, like someone who had once heard that same sentence in her own mind. "I can't be your family, but I can hold your hand, like someone who never had theirs held." When Naraya stepped out of the room, the sun had risen high. The hallway glowed, the wood floor catching the light like glass. She paused, looking down at her hand, still warm from that quiet, sacred contact, and she understood. Healing doesn't always come from the hand that holds yours. Sometimes it's in the hand you reach out. Back in her office, she opened the logbook and wrote a single line. "I touched a loneliness too deep to name, and in it I found myself." Late afternoon light no longer blazed. It washed the wooden desk in gold, soft and steady, inside the head nurse's office. Naraya sat by the window. The small plant beside her had grown a few more leaves, and her notebook lay open to the page where she'd written about Mrs. Clara's hand that morning. A quiet knock at the door. Not urgent, not abrupt. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Everin stepped in. He brought nothing with him, just a stillness in his expression as if holding a question he hadn't yet figured out how to ask. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. She nodded. Didn't offer him a seat, but didn't stop him either. He pulled the chair across from her. Not too close. Just close enough not to feel like a guest. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Only the ceiling fan stirred the silence, and between them, a stillness like water, quiet and deep, between two people who had once loved, once left, and once lacked the courage to return. Everin looked at her, really looked for the first time since his mother passed. "Have you ever told your story to anyone?" he asked. Naraya didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted out the window where the sun slanted across the back courtyard like an old tablecloth spread thin by time. She turned a page in her notebook. "Never. All of it," she said. "No one ever asked for all of it." Evren didn't move, so she began. No tears, no drama, just the voice of someone who, for once, allowed herself to be at the center of her own story, even if just for this moment. "My father died when I was 22. I left college to care for him in his final 10 months. I thought if I took good enough care, maybe he wouldn't hurt, but he did. And then he was gone. She paused, eyes unblinking. I didn't go back to university. I enrolled in a short nursing program because I needed to learn how to do it better, how to care for someone I couldn't save. Evren bowed his head. She went on. As for the dream of becoming a writer, I folded it away. I used to send stories to little magazines. Nothing was ever accepted. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. No one knows this, but once I wrote an entire story just about a forgotten umbrella left under a porch. And then I was the one left standing in the real rain. Evren's hands clenched slightly. In his lap, she hadn't said his name, but he knew who she meant. Silence again, deep and respectful. Then his voice, quiet, careful, as if afraid to break what had just been offered. I'm sorry that I never asked you sooner. Naraya shook her head gently. I don't need pity. I just need someone to remember. I once had dreams, too. He looked at her longer than he ever had. Not to fix anything, not to atone. Just to see her, clearly, fully, without the haze of memory, expectation, or guilt. As he stood to leave, Naraya added, softly, a final grace note. Some stories don't need to be published, just heard. Once. Fully, that's enough. The afternoon slipped further. At the window, the sunlight began to pull back from the floor, giving way to a dimmer, softer light, but not a colder one. Inside, two people remained seated, not regretting, not reclaiming, not asking for anything more. Just, for the first time, a story had been told. And someone had truly listened. Thursday evening. The sky hung low and gray. A light rain had just swept across the parking lot outside Shama, leaving puddles that mirrored the warm, yellow glow of hallway lights. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. The whole building seemed to breathe in quiet unison, like someone recovering from a long procedure who only wanted stillness. Naraya walked the hallway, her hand holding next week's therapy schedule. She wore her usual white coat, hair tied back, soft-soled nursing shoes silent against the floor. As she passed the door to the group therapy room, where the last session had ended barely 10 minutes before, she paused. The lights inside were still on. No patients remained, but someone was there, bending to gather each chair, lining them neatly against the wall. A pale blue shirt. A familiar shape. Evren. He didn't know she was watching. No one had asked him. No one had assigned it. No one would note it down. He just did it, stacking the chairs, adjusting each leg so they wouldn't scrape against one another. When he finished, he took a tissue and wiped the table's surface. Maybe someone had spilled tea, or maybe he just didn't want anyone else to clean up after him. Naraya didn't step inside. She stayed in the doorway, just long enough to witness something quiet but unmistakable. A man who once lived. At the center of the room, now choosing the edge. Not to watch, not to prove, just to help. A small act. No explanation. But to her, it rang louder than any "I'm sorry" ever had. Evren, unaware she was there, stood for a moment when the room was finished. He didn't leave right away. He stood in the stillness, lit by the overhead glow, his eyes soft. He rested a hand on the back of a nearby chair. Didn't pull it out, didn't sit, just placed his hand there, as if to test something quietly within himself. I can stay here, without reason, without title. When Evren finally left, Naraya stepped inside. The chairs were perfectly aligned, the tables clean, no trace of disinfectant, just the faint, earthy scent of damp wood, of a space that had endured and was slowly being restored. She didn't smile, but as she sat in one of the chairs, she gave a small nod, an unspoken thank you held safely in her chest. Back in her office, Naraya opened her notebook and wrote, "Not everyone needs to stand in front to be seen. Some are remembered simply because they did the right thing, quietly. A man who once stood on the wrong side of the door, now choosing to stay in a room no one named him for. Not to redeem, but to be part of a place where others are healing, even if no one is watching." Saturday morning began more slowly than usual. No alarms, no hurried footsteps, no voices echoing through the hall. The entire Shama Center seemed to exhale, a long, quiet breath, warm and gentle, as if even the building itself was learning how to soften after a long week. Naraya arrived early. She always did on weekends, when there were fewer new patients, no emergency meetings, no reports waiting for her signature. She liked the stillness of the morning, when the air was still heavy with mist. The sunlight hadn't yet reached the edge of her desk, and everything in the room sat hushed, like a whisper. She set her bag down, poured herself a little black coffee, and as she settled into her chair, her eyes caught something that didn't belong to the day's schedule. A pale ivory envelope, resting quietly between the small potted plant and her open notebook. No one left letters on her desk, especially not here, where internal email was the norm and unspoken boundaries were respectfully kept. There was no sender's name, no address, just a handwritten line across the front, to the one who stayed. The handwriting leaned slightly to the right, unadorned, careful. It looked very much like someone she knew. Naraya stilled. Her pulse tapped gently against her ribs. She didn't open it right away. She picked it up, running her finger along the worn edges, like the writer had held it over and over, hesitating, before finding the courage to finish. Then she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, unscented, unadorned, black ink, and the first line held only 6 words. "This isn't an apology letter." She straightened. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, not from the breeze but from something deep inside her beginning to shift. "This isn't an apology letter. It's a thank you. Thank you for staying, not for me. Not for any half-spoken love. Not out of duty, but for something I never understood, until I saw you hold the hand of someone who had no one." Naraya paused. She remembered that moment, her hand resting gently on Clara's in the quiet of the therapy room. A touch with no response, no gratitude, just a soft dissolving of dry skin and years of silence. And Evren had seen. No one had known he was there. But somehow, he had seen. I used to think walking away meant less pain, that stepping back would keep things from breaking. But you, by choosing not to leave, reminded me of the part of myself I'd dropped. Somewhere along the way, Naraya inhaled slowly. She didn't want to cry. She didn't need to, because what she was reading wasn't a plea. It was something she'd once waited years for. And now it had arrived at the very moment she no longer needed it in order to live. I don't know what I can fix. Maybe nothing. But if I can lay down a single stone where you once stumbled, then this letter is how I begin. She folded the page carefully, placed it beside her cooling coffee. Her hand rested lightly on the envelope, as if there were something delicate she needed to keep from fading when the sun finally reached the desk. She didn't smile, didn't press her lips together, just sat still, with a silence as soft as rain-fed soil. 10 minutes later, she opened the bottom drawer, the one that held an old handkerchief stitched with N.V. and the manuscript of a short story she'd never sent out. Now, she placed the letter there too. Not to hide it, but to keep it. Because sometimes a thing without a name, like an envelope without a sender, says more than anything written clearly ever could. Later that afternoon, while tidying, up after group therapy, a nurse asked quietly, "Did someone special leave you something today?" Naraya simply nodded. "Yes. A thank you without a name." Must be precious, huh? It doesn't need to be, just needs to be true. Before leaving the office, she opened the clinical notebook. A new page, a fresh pen. Her first line wasn't about a patient. She wrote, "Someone once lacked the courage to stay. But today, they found the strength to say thank you without expecting anything in return." As she switched off the lights, the last sliver of sunlight fell across the desk, catching on the edge of the ivory envelope. She didn't lock the drawer, because some things no longer need to be hidden. Late Friday afternoon. The sky held no sun, but it wasn't heavy either. That in-between weather made everything at Shama Center slow just slightly, as if the whole place were adjusting its rhythm to the hearts of those still learning how to live again after loss. Group therapy had just ended. Patients rose one by one, gathering their chairs, lining them up neatly, the room filled with soft laughter, the click of wood meeting wood, and light-hearted farewells. "Have a good weekend," drifting through the air like gentle mist. Naraya stood in the corner, notebook in hand. Her eyes passed over each empty seat, pausing when they landed on the one beside the window. That chair wasn't part of the assigned layout. No one was ever asked to sit there. But every week, she left it in place. A deliberate silence. Few noticed. Only she knew it was the chair once meant for someone, and always put away last. Today, she didn't put it away. She just stood there, watching. A moment longer than usual, her fingers brushed the back of the chair. The wood was cool beneath her touch, familiar as a memory you can still shape with your hands. Once the room emptied, only the soft yellow light from the overhead fixture remained, casting a warm glow on the walls. A breeze slipped in from the hallway, rustling the curtain like a whisper no one could quite catch. Footsteps echoed behind her. Slow, even, unhurried. No one announced their presence. No one called her name, but Naraya knew. Evren had come. He entered the room without disturbing its quiet. His gaze swept gently over the empty space before settling on the chair, the one that hadn't been claimed. No greeting, no asking permission. He simply walked to it, pulled it closer and sat down beside her. Not too close, just enough. Neither spoke. They sat without leaning in, without touching. But her hand rested near his, close enough that they were no longer strangers, close enough to hear the breath of someone who had once stood on the wrong side of a closed door and was now choosing to stay, not as a promise, not as a plea, but simply to be near. The breeze stirred again. A piece of paper slipped from the edge of the table, landing near his feet. Evren picked it up and placed it back, carefully, like returning something that had been left behind too long. Naraya didn't turn to him. She only spoke, softly, as if to herself. I don't need to be loved again, just to sit beside someone. One last time, as myself. Evren didn't answer, but he tilted his head slightly toward her. And together they looked out the window, where the late afternoon light traced a delicate outline across the wooden floor. In the silence, something gentle spread. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acceptance. Acceptance that some things cannot be restored and don't need to be. Sometimes it's enough, simply to sit side by side. Two people who know each other's pain, with no need to redefine it. At 5 o'clock, Naraya rose first. She didn't say goodbye, didn't invite him to follow. She only placed her hand on the back of the chair, the one that had always been empty, and today was not. Evren understood. He stood, slid the chair back into the circle. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but right in the middle. As he stepped out of the room, Naraya stood by the door. They didn't look at each other long. Just a quiet nod. Two people who had once lost each other and somehow found their way back. The next day, the chair remained in its place, and the week after, it was empty again. But no longer lonely, because someone had once chosen to stay. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment. Somewhere out there, someone else may be walking through a similar ache. Thank you for staying with it until the end. And if you'd like to keep walking this path of healing, with stories that hold you gently, don't forget to like and subscribe.